In the gray dawn light of July 5, 1943, as the opening salvos of Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great offensive on the Eastern Front, thundered across the rolling steppes near Kursk, 1,800 German tanks began their advance toward what they believed would be decisive victory. Above them, the sound of aircraft engines grew steadily louder as waves of Soviet Il-2 Sturmoviks approached, their armored bellies packed with a new and terrifying weapon that would change the nature of tank warfare forever. In the hours that followed, W. Liss in Aircraft Profile 88, Ilyushin Il-2 mentions an engagement during the Battle of Kursk on 7th July 1943, in which 70 tanks from the German 9th Panzer Division were claimed to be destroyed by Ilyushin Il-2s in just 20 minutes. This was not the beginning of the Il-2's deadly career, but rather its culmination. During the war, 36,183 units of the Il-2 were produced, and in combination with its successor, the Ilyushin Il-10, a total of 42,030 were built, making it the single most produced military aircraft design in aviation history, as well as one of the most produced piloted aircraft. Yet behind these staggering production numbers lay a more sinister statistic, one that German tank commanders on the Eastern Front came to understand with growing horror. Thousands of German panzers that rolled east toward Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk would never return home, their metal carcasses scattered across the vastness of Russia, victims of an aircraft that German soldiers would come to call the Black Death. The Il-2 Sturmovik was born from desperate necessity and revolutionary engineering. Simply bolting on armor plates is liable to make an airplane fly like a brick. Ilyushin's solution was to make the steel armor an integral load-bearing element of the Il-2's monocoque fuselage, even though the rear of the aircraft and the wings panels were still made of wood. This innovative design philosophy created an aircraft unlike anything that had ever flown, a machine built specifically to survive the hellish environment of low-altitude ground attack, where every farm field could conceal anti-aircraft guns and every hedgerow might hide a machine gun nest. The result was an aircraft of unprecedented durability. An armored tub 5 to 12 millimeters thick shielded the cockpit, fuel tanks, AM-38 engine, and radiators. Even the canopy averaged 6 centimeters of armored glass. This was not merely protective plating added as an afterthought, but integral armor that formed the structural backbone of the aircraft itself. When German pilots first encountered the Il-2 in combat, they discovered to their dismay that their machine guns and even 20mm cannon shells often bounced harmlessly off the Sturmovik's armored hide. Thrust into a desperate effort to blunt German advancing mechanized spearheads, Sturmovik pilots discovered their armor rendered the Il-2 nearly immune to machine gun fire from the front, and even gave it a chance to survive 20mm cannon shells. This survivability came at a terrible cost in performance. The Il-2 was slow, unwieldy, and struggled to keep pace with conventional fighters. But in the grinding attritional warfare of the Eastern Front, survivability trumped speed every time. The Germans quickly developed a grudging respect for their armored adversary. German pilots dubbed the Il-2 the concrete bomber, a commentary perhaps both on its durability and agility, or lack thereof. But this nickname failed to capture the true terror that the Il-2 inspired among German ground forces. The Luftwaffe took to calling it the flying tank, concrete plane, or even Iron Gustav because of its highly effective armor protection, while German tankers and infantrymen referred to it as the Butcher, or even the Black Death because of the destruction left in the wake of an Il-2 attack. The hatred was so intense that it drove German soldiers to acts of battlefield brutality that violated every convention of war. The plane was so detested that it became a fairly common practice on the Eastern Front for frustrated and battle-weary Wehrmacht soldiers to simply open the canopy of a downed Sturmovik and fire point-blank into the head of an injured pilot. This barbaric behavior reflected not just the dehumanizing nature of the Eastern Front, but the genuine terror that the Il-2 inspired among German forces who had learned through bitter experience what it meant to be on the receiving end of a Sturmovik attack. The Il-2's introduction to combat was inauspicious. There were 249 Il-2s available on 22 June 1941. In the first 3 days, 4th Schap had lost 10 Il-2s to enemy action. A further 19 were lost to other causes, and 20 pilots were killed. By 10th July, 4th Schap was down to 10 aircraft from a strength of 65. These devastating losses reflected both the inexperience of Soviet pilots and the tactical shortcomings of the early Il-2 design, which lacked a rear gunner to defend against German fighters. The initial vulnerability of the Il-2 to fighter attack nearly ended its career before it truly began. However, the Sturmoviks sustained devastating losses as faster German fighter planes swooped around to hit their unarmored rears. During periods of intense fighting, 1 Sturmovik was being lost for every 10 combat missions, a ratio that would improve to 1 loss for every 26 missions in 1943. These unsustainable losses forced a fundamental redesign of the aircraft. Heavy losses to enemy fighters made reincorporating a rear gunner imperative by early 1942. The revived 2-seater now featured a gunner's portal, and early single-seat variants were modified by cutting a hole in the back of the canopy to accommodate the machine gun. This modification dramatically improved the Il-2's survivability and marked the beginning of its transformation from vulnerable ground attack aircraft to the terror of the Eastern Front. As Soviet pilots gained experience and tactics evolved, the Il-2 began to fulfill its deadly promise. Tactics improved as Soviet aircrews became used to the Il-2's strengths. Instead of a low, horizontal straight approach at 50 meters, 160 FTU altitude, the target was usually kept to the pilot's left, and a turn and shallow dive of 30 degrees was used, using an echeloned assault by 4 to 12 aircraft at a time. These refined tactics maximized the Il-2's survivability, while bringing its devastating firepower to bear most effectively against German ground targets. The Il-2's armament evolved throughout the war to meet the changing demands of ground attack warfare. Initially armed with 20mm cannons and machine guns, the aircraft soon sprouted a fearsome array of anti-tank weapons. The Il-2 disposed of a variety of specialized anti-tank weapons. It could carry 8 82mm or 4 132mm rockets, but despite their excellent armor-piercing ability, they proved too inaccurate to be highly effective. The rockets, while powerful enough to destroy any German tank with a direct hit, suffered from the same accuracy problems that plagued all unguided munitions of the era. Soviet engineers solved this problem with one of the most innovative weapons of World War II, the PTAB anti-tank bomblet. PTAB bomblets carried in underwing dispensers were better because they required less precision. Around 200 of the 3-pound-shaped charges could be deployed like cluster munitions to carpet an area 70 meters long and 15 meters wide with armor-piercing bomblets. The PTABs were small 5.5-pound armor-piercing shaped bomblets, capable of penetrating the top armor of any of the German tanks then in the field. The PTABs were dropped from altitudes as low as 320 feet and had a destructive zone of some 50 by 230 feet. The PTAB represented a revolutionary approach to anti-tank warfare. Instead of requiring precision to hit individual targets, Up to 192 were carried in 4 external dispensers, cluster bombs, or up to 220 in the inner wing panel's internal ventral weapon bays. The charge could easily penetrate the relatively thin upper armor of all heavy German tanks. This carpet-bombing approach to tank destruction was perfectly suited to the Il-2's limitations and maximized its effectiveness against massed armor formations. The psychological impact of the PTAB was as important as its physical effectiveness. The initial use of the PTABs proved to be a tactical surprise, reportedly dumbfounding the Germans and undermining their morale. German tank crews, accustomed to the relative safety of their thick frontal armor, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to attack from above by weapons they could neither see coming nor effectively defend against. The tactical deployment of PTABs first appeared during the Battle of Kursk, where they would play a decisive role in blunting German armored offensives. They were first used in the Battle of Kursk and were found to be effective because the bomblets were much easier for inexperienced pilots to use than other anti-tank weapons. They also eliminated the downtime needed to re-aim the cannon. This ease of use was crucial, as many Il-2 pilots were hastily trained replacements with limited experience in precision ground attack. The Battle of Kursk marked the Il-2's finest hour and demonstrated its ability to influence the course of major armored battles. As Operation Citadel began, Soviet forces deployed their Sturmovix in unprecedented numbers and with deadly new tactics. Il-2 pilots in Kursk began flying in circles of death over the battlefield to cover each other's tails from enemy fighters, one aircraft at a time peeling away to make ground attack runs before rejoining the circle. To prevent increasing losses from enemy fighters, the Circle of Death tactic was initiated, in which 8 Sturmovix flew in a tight circle over the target area. In succession, each would peel off and dive down to attack, while the others covered it with their rear gunners, after which it would rejoin the circle and another would take its turn. This tactical innovation solved the Il-2's fundamental vulnerability to fighter attack while maximizing its ground attack effectiveness. The circular formation provided mutual protection while ensuring a continuous stream of attacks on German ground targets. The psychological effect on German troops was devastating. The constant presence of circling Sturmovix overhead, with their inevitable succession of diving attacks, created an atmosphere of inescapable doom that shattered unit cohesion and morale. The results were immediate and spectacular. German air power, including new Ju-87G Stukas and Heis-129 attack planes with tank-busting cannons, supposedly single-handedly blunted the advance of the 2nd Guards Tanks Corps on July 8th, knocking out 50 tanks. The day before, Sturmovix reportedly destroyed 70 tanks of the German 9th Panzer Division, halting its advance. These early successes were only the beginning of a sustained campaign of destruction that would cripple German armored operations throughout the Kursk salient. The claims made by Il-2 pilots during Kursk bordered on the fantastic. Sturmovik pilots reported the destruction of 270 tanks in the 3rd Panzer Division and 240 tanks of the 17th Panzer Division. Curiously, these two units had only 90 and 67 operational tanks at the beginning of the battle, respectively. In one instance, pilots claimed to have destroyed more than 70 German tanks in less than 20 minutes. However, perhaps the most extraordinary claim made by Air Force's pilots was that in just 4 hours, 240 tanks from the 17th Panzer Division were either destroyed or damaged, though these claims are largely unsubstantiated, and what actually constituted damaged has always been debatable. Modern historians and military analysts have questioned these extravagant claims. noting that they exceed the number of tanks actually available to the German units allegedly destroyed. In reality, there is considerable evidence that reports of tanks killed by aircraft were greatly exaggerated by pilots of all nations in World War II. Operational research by teams on the ground tended to find that fewer than 10% of tank losses were attributable to air power. Other studies of the fighting at Kursk suggest that very few of German armor losses were caused by the IL-2 or any other Soviet aircraft. In fact, total German tank losses in Operation Citadel amounted to 323 destroyed, the vast majority by anti-tank guns and armored fighting vehicles. The reality of tank destruction in World War II was far more complex than the dramatic accounts of aerial tank busting suggested. The rockets, bombs, and heavy cannons used by ground attack planes were simply too inaccurate, and most could only penetrate the top armor of a tank, necessitating steep angles of attack. Even the fearsome PTAB bomblets, while effective against thin top armor, required direct hits to achieve tank kills, and many damaged tanks could be recovered and repaired if their crews survived. However, the true impact of the IL-2 extended far beyond simple tank kill statistics. Nonetheless, attack planes like the Sturmovik could still disrupt armored attacks, blast entrenched troops and artillery, and strafe columns of soft-skinned trucks and light armor. The psychological effect of constant air attack was equally important. German tank crews operating under the constant threat of Sturmovik attack became cautious, hesitant, and prone to abandoning damaged vehicles that might otherwise have been recovered. The broader strategic impact of IL-2 operations extended well beyond individual tank kills. Airstrikes by Sturmoviks would play a major role in crippling the effort to resupply the German Sixth Army trapped in Stalingrad during the winter of 1942–43, destroying 72 German aircraft on the ground at the airfield of Skalsk and shooting down numerous transports in the air. The airbase was packed full of nearly 150 Luftwaffe aircraft, and a daring low-altitude raid to the base saw German defenses caught completely by surprise, with 72 aircraft ultimately destroyed. These attacks on German logistics and transportation infrastructure were perhaps more strategically significant than direct tank kills. A series of deafening explosions rocked the 4 trains that sat exposed on the tracks, and a large black plume rose high into the sky, as the station itself was obstructed from view in the wake of the destructive attack. All 4 trains were destroyed by just the 2 Soviet Stormbirds, with a substantial loss of German personnel, fuel, tanks, and ammunition vital to the continued war effort. By targeting supply lines, airfields, and transportation hubs, the IL-2 disrupted the entire German war machine on the Eastern Front. The cumulative effect of thousands of IL-2 sorties was the systematic degradation of German operational capability. Despite, or perhaps because of those qualities, the IL-2 became a constant presence on the battlefields of the Eastern Front, causing havoc to the forces of the German Wehrmacht. Infantry, horses, trucks, trains, artillery, and even tanks were prime targets for the IL-2. Anything on the battlefield was a target. So too were fuel depots, airfields, and other support infrastructure just behind the front lines. The human cost of facing the IL-2 was reflected in the accounts of individual pilots who became legendary figures in Soviet aviation. Armenian Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Stepanyan is recorded to have sunk 13 German ships single-handedly, scored 27 air-to-air kills, blasted 5 bridges, and destroyed nearly 700 vehicles on the ground. After being hit in a raid over Latvia in December 1944, he rammed his flaming aircraft into the deck of a German warship. Anna Timofeeva Yegorova, a peasant's daughter, became squadron commander of the 805th Assault Aviation Regiment, and flew 243 combat missions in her Sturmovik before she was blasted out of her plane by anti-aircraft fire in August 1944. The individual achievements of pilots like Stepanyan and Timofeyeva Yegorova represented the collective impact of thousands of Il-2 aircrew who flew sortie after sortie against German ground targets. Before the war was over, he had flown 92 sorties on the Eastern Front, was proclaimed a hero of the Soviet Union, and had been shot down 3 times with the sturdy, armor-hardened plane saving his life in each brush with death. These repeated combat missions, sustained over years of warfare, created a cumulative effect that far exceeded the impact of any single dramatic engagement. The Il-2's versatility extended beyond pure ground attack. Nonetheless, such was the desperation of the air war over the Eastern Front then, that the Il-2 was frequently called upon to serve as a fighter. While the Sturmovik had no way of keeping pace with German fighters, it proved deadly in taking down slower German bomber, observation, and transport planes, resulting in several Il-2 aces. This adaptability reflected both the aircraft's robust design and the desperate circumstances of the early war period when Soviet forces used every available weapon in their struggle for survival. The production story of the Il-2 revealed the industrial might that ultimately won the war on the Eastern Front. The VVS lost over 4,000 aircraft of all types in the disastrous first month of hostilities. The 4th Regiment, for example, lost 55 of its 65 Sturmoviks, and the Il-2 production facilities had to be evacuated east of the Ural Mountains, interrupting deliveries for 2 months. Despite these early setbacks, Soviet industry demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. 36,183 Il-2 Sturmoviks were produced between 1941 and 1944 before production switched to the Il-10. At one point in 1943, the Il-2 comprised 30% of the total Soviet air power. This massive production achievement reflected not just industrial capacity, but strategic priority. Stalin famously declared the Il-2 was as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. Stalin demanded increased production, famously stating, "They are as essential to the Red Army as air and bread." This demand highlighted its critical role on the battlefield, becoming a symbol of Soviet resilience during World War II. The design philosophy behind the Il-2 emphasized mass production and ease of maintenance over sophistication. The design of the Il-2 was intended to make it easy to mass produce, sometimes even by unskilled labor. This approach proved crucial during wartime conditions when skilled workers were in short supply and production facilities faced constant disruption from bombing and evacuation. The aircraft's robust construction and simple systems made it ideally suited to the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. The Sturmovik's robust landing gear was also designed to handle rough front-line airstrips. The Il-2 had a sturdy undercarriage that enabled often quickly trained pilots to take off and land on comparatively primitive airfields. This capability allowed Il-2 units to operate from forward bases close to the front lines, reducing transit time to targets and increasing sortie rates. The technological innovations incorporated in the Il-2 went beyond armor protection. The Il-2s had an ingenious method of surviving hits to the fuel tanks by pumping carbon dioxide into them if they were penetrated. When approaching the target, we opened carbon dioxide canisters, which filled the empty space of fuel tanks. If a bullet pierced the body and hit a fuel tank, the sealer would fill the hole. Fuel would not leak out. There would be no vapor, and consequently, no combustion. This fire suppression system dramatically improved survivability by preventing fuel explosions, one of the primary causes of aircraft loss in combat. The German response to the Il-2 threat revealed the extent of its impact on Wehrmacht operations. Larger, more capable anti-aircraft guns, like the infamous 88 mm, were too slow in movement and rate of fire to hit low-flying aircraft, so smaller calibers were a bigger threat to Il-2s. This forced the Germans to deploy significant resources to anti-aircraft defense, diverting weapons and personnel from other uses. The 88 mm guns that might have been used as anti-tank weapons or for anti-aircraft defense against high-altitude bombers instead had to be repositioned to deal with low-flying Sturmovix. The effectiveness of the Il-2 against German armor must be understood in the context of overall German tank losses on the Eastern Front. Let's be blunt. The German army lost World War II on the Eastern Front. For most of the war, 75–80% of the Wehrmacht had to be deployed in the East, a preponderance dictated by the sheer size of the front, and 80% of German war dead perished there. About 4 million of the 5 million German soldiers killed in World War II. While not all of these losses were attributable to air attack, the Il-2 was a constant presence in this grinding war of attrition. German tank losses on the Eastern Front were staggering in their scope. While precise numbers remain disputed by historians, German tank production prior to hostilities in 1939 equaled about 3,500. Between 1939 till 1945, they produced another 46,074 tanks, including the Panther, Tiger the One, and the Lotsekunu, and the Elephant. Of these, some 25,000 were destroyed in battle. The majority of these losses occurred on the Eastern Front, where the combination of Soviet armor, artillery, mines, and air attack created a cauldron of destruction that consumed German armor at an unsustainable rate. The testimony of German commanders themselves revealed the complexity of tank losses in combat. Heinz Guderian: 60–70% through mechanical failures, Eastern Front. 15% AT, anti-tank. 5% artillery, 5% mines, and 5% others. While Guderian's figures suggest that mechanical failures were the primary cause of tank losses, other German commanders provided different assessments. Paul Hauser: during long movements to the zone of action, 20–30% of all tanks en route fall out due to mechanical failures. Considering the remainder as 100%, 15% are lost through mechanical failures, 20% through air attacks, 50% through AT defense, and 15% are knocked out by artillery. Hauser's assessment credited air attacks with 20% of tank losses among those that reached combat, a significant proportion that validated the Il-2's strategic importance. Even if the dramatic individual claims of Il-2 pilots were exaggerated, the cumulative effect of thousands of sorties over nearly 4 years of warfare clearly had a major impact on German armored operations. The true measure of the Il-2's effectiveness lay not in individual tank kills, but in its contribution to the overall collapse of German military power on the Eastern Front. Though the claims may have been inflated, there's little doubt that Sturmovix were menaces and that ground forces considered them godsends, if not for their effectiveness, for their ability to raise Soviet morale while having debilitating psychological effects on Wehrmacht troops. This psychological dimension of aerial warfare was as important as the physical destruction inflicted by Sturmovik attacks. The legacy of the Il-2 extended well beyond World War II. In many ways, the Sturmovik was a forerunner of today's A-10 Warthog, developed by Fairchild Republic for the U.S. Air Force and used for close air support, which is capable of providing punishing damage to hardened ground targets while protecting its pilot with its toughened shell. The A-10 Thunderbolt Hawk can spew 30 mm high explosive rounds from a 7-barreled high-speed cannon protruding from its nose, and can carry a deadly array of rockets and other weapons under its wings. The design principles pioneered by the Il-2 heavy armor protection, specialized anti-armor weapons, and focus on survivability over performance became the foundation for subsequent generations of ground attack aircraft. This aircraft inspired later Soviet attack planes, including the Su-25 Frogfoot. Its enduring influence in military aviation history is a testament to its innovative design and battlefield effectiveness. The post-war career of surviving Il-2 aircraft demonstrated their continuing military value. North Korea received 93 Il-10s, which served in its 57th Assault Aviation Regiment. These played a major role in blasting South Korean troops in the opening weeks of the Korean War in 1950. But as U.S. air power entered the fray, more than 70 were shot down or destroyed on the ground, and the type was withdrawn from frontline operations. The Il-10, successor to the Il-2, continued the Sturmovik tradition into the jet age before finally being overtaken by advancing technology. The human cost of Il-2 operations was enormous, reflecting the desperate nature of the Eastern Front. Soviet records state that a total of 11,000 Il-2s were lost in action during World War II, although some sources estimate the true total to be twice that. All told, more than 20 pilots were killed in less than a week, and the men and women who replaced them were often even less experienced. In the early going, Il-2 pilots generally attacked armored columns flying straight and low, often just 200 feet, 61 meters over the ground, exposing themselves to intense ground fire in order to achieve maximum effectiveness against German targets. The tactical evolution of Il-2 operations reflected the harsh lessons learned in combat. In the early going, Il-2 pilots generally attacked armored columns flying straight and low, often just 200 feet, 61 millimeters over the ground, which gave gunners relatively predictable targets. As losses mounted and experience accumulated, Soviet commanders developed more sophisticated tactics that balanced effectiveness with survivability. Tactics were further honed to include attacks of even more aircraft in precise coordination with tanks, artillery, and infantry. This integrated approach to combined arms warfare maximized the Il-2's effectiveness while providing mutual support between different weapon systems. The coordination between ground and air forces became a hallmark of later Soviet military doctrine, with roots traceable to the hard-won lessons of Il-2 operations. The measurement of the Il-2's true impact on German tank losses requires consideration of multiple factors beyond direct combat damage. The mere presence of Il-2s over the battlefield influenced German tactical decisions, forcing tank crews to seek cover, abandon damaged vehicles that might otherwise have been recovered, and operate with reduced effectiveness due to constant fear of air attack. Tank formations under air attack became dispersed and cautious, losing the concentration and momentum essential for successful armored operations. The logistical impact of Il-2 operations was equally important in degrading German armored capability. By targeting supply convoys, fuel depots, repair facilities, and transportation infrastructure, Sturmoviks disrupted the entire support system that kept German armor operational. A tank without fuel or spare parts was as effectively destroyed as one hit by a PTAB bomblet, and the Il-2's ability to interdict German logistics had cumulative effects that went far beyond battlefield kill statistics. The strategic bombing campaign conducted by Il-2 units against German aircraft production facilities and related infrastructure also contributed to the collapse of German air power, which in turn left German ground forces more vulnerable to all forms of air attack. This created a positive feedback loop. Reduced German air cover led to increased effectiveness of Soviet ground attack aircraft, which in turn caused more damage to German ground forces and infrastructure. The final accounting of German tank losses on the Eastern Front reveals the magnitude of the disaster that befell the Wehrmacht. While precise numbers remain disputed, it is clear that the majority of German tank production, perhaps 30,000 or more armored vehicles, was consumed in the vast battles across Eastern Europe. Of these losses, air attack accounted for a significant percentage, with the Il-2 responsible for the majority of aircraft-inflicted damage. The transformation of the Il-2 from vulnerable ground attack aircraft to Black Death of the Eastern Front represented more than technological evolution. It embodied the broader transformation of the Red Army from a shattered force fleeing toward Moscow to the victorious army that would plant its flag over the ruins of Berlin. The 5,000 German tanks that never escaped the Eastern Front, whether destroyed by PTAB bomblets, immobilized by rocket attacks, or abandoned due to the disruption of supply lines, represented the cumulative achievement of 36,000 Il-2 Sturmovix and the tens of thousands of Soviet aircrew who flew them into combat. In the end, the Il-2's legacy cannot be measured solely in terms of tank kills or sortie statistics. It was an instrument of strategic destruction that helped break the back of German military power on the Eastern Front. Every German tank that fell victim to Sturmovik attack, every supply convoy that was scattered by strafing runs, every airfield that was cratered by bombing attacks, contributed to the inexorable advance of Soviet forces toward ultimate victory. It was designed for survival in the hostile, flak and fighter-filled skies of the Eastern Front, where the Germans risked so much and suffered more than 70% of their causalities during World War II. The Il-2 Sturmovik was not just an aircraft, it was a weapon of national survival, forged in desperation and tempered by the fires of the most brutal conflict in human history. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the thousands of German tanks scattered across the Eastern Front stood as monuments to the deadly effectiveness of Stalin's flying tank and the men and women who flew it into the maelstrom of war.